Okay, and did your parents choose it?
Because there is
Very interesting.
in reality there is an internal conflict because my for my father was the main
Ah, okay.
but for my mother was the name typical name in Spain.
Okay.
They are they were two different. Okay. I have to demonstrate with Italian stuff. Let's start. It's a great pleasure to introduce the credit first time real thing. That was one of the members of the POE, was one of the founders of this experience. She's the chef, comme de société d'action sociale, c'est une associée. Where we realized several studies about the life experience of the European movements as a sociologist, and so.
Thank you, Salvo. And first of all, I wanted to say how much I'm happy to see this first summer school of POE physically here together. I mean, because we have two editions, but online editions of the summer school. So it's really, and I'm really full of happiness and a lot of emotions for being here with all of you. So in the previous two editions of the summer school, we always had a moment about social movements. So Céline's presentation follows this line of reasoning inside this summer school about social movements. And usually this session is also the sessions in which we discuss as well about research methodologies, how we do research. So it's more, let's say, empirically grounded than other interventions in which we discuss from other perspectives, more political and philosophical in their nature. So the environmental issues as a ground for mobilization raises several problems to the main theories of social movement understandings, meaning that, I mean, theory of social movements are not always adequately addressing environmental movements and mobilizations. So that's why environmental movement analysis is a quite interesting issue. And I wanted to stress the importance of Céline's work as an example of an intersection between science and technology studies and social movement studies. This frontier between STS and social movements is not frequented by many researchers. So Céline's work is one example of this bridging of STS with social movement studies. For example, another sociologist doing this is David Hess, whose work Céline quoted. And for those of you who are interested in STS and social movement issues, for sure, David Hess' work is a very important work, because Hess was one of the main example of an internal critique inside STS studies that show how STS studies are not always able to address power issues in techno-scientific controversies. And so Hess wrote an important article about neoliberalism and the history of STS theory, which can be an interesting reading for those of you who are into this kind of problematics. So STS approaches often focus on how agents perform or construct their words rather than how their words shape them. And that's why STS approaches often are unable to properly detect the implications of the neoliberal term of co-management of risks, because they are somewhat akin to these epistemological assumptions of the importance of agency in creating the words. And so even the idea of symmetry, which is quite important in STS analysis of controversies, can be problematic. And Sedzin work showed how it is possible to historicize and contextualize movement agencies in a broader field analysis and into a frame of contentious politics. So the example, I mean, a research on the nuclear controversies in France is an example of how you can historicize and even contextualize controversies into an analysis of a field and field traversed by different forms of power. Of course, environmental mobilizations need an understanding of socio-technical controversies, because in a world of increasing technological complexity, social movements are confronted with the need to address complex issues of scientific expertise and technological design. And that's why, I mean, the tools of STS are for sure important for even an ecological political perspectives. But provided that we frame these controversies as a situation of contentious knowledge, not simply of socio-technical disagreements that are understandable just in the frame of the technical controversies. And Sedzin work is interesting for me in another aspect, which is the move from social movements to mobilized publics. This is another important shift, because her analysis is not so much into the subject, the movement as a subject. It's not about the movement as in its internal logic, all that social theory movement is interested in, which is the identity, the kind of dynamic internal to the social movement. Sedzin's approach is more concerned with understanding movements inside mobilized publics, so inside something which is more complex, that is organized groups who mobilize for changes in science and technology in support of the public interest. So that, of course, these mobilized publics often point to the problem of undone science, for example, which is one of the topics that you address. I mean, the systematic absence of research identified by counter publics. So there is this dynamic of publics and counter publics when they seek to document potential risks and uncertainties of technologies. So I wanted to stress this because, of course, this is of interest for those of you who are into studying social movements. The shift from movement to publics can be an interesting move when addressing socio-technical issues. Sedzin, in her work on nuclear critical movements or counter publics in France, chooses to historicize, so to show a long-term perspective on the scene of the evolution of publics and counter publics. And this is another methodological dimension that I want to stress. Which is the interest of putting what we observe today in an analysis of long term, because the case of Sedzin shows very well how the way to discipline critique can rely on previous mobilization and on what governments understand of these counter publics. So if we just take the last episode, we fail to understand a lot of how then disciplining powers is actually working, because it's relying on something that is built in an experience done in a story of movement and counter movements, let's say. These are so the shift from movements to public is one point. The historicization of the publics is the other point. The third point is about scientization. So the issue of scientization that you raised, Cécile. And so you point out that scientization does not automatically signify depolitization. So and I wanted to say something about this link between ecology and science, because, for example, in Italy, so when the environment, the movement of political ecology was born in the 70s, the link with science was fundamental. Political ecology was presented as scientific and political environmentalism, and the first main figures of political ecology were intellectuals and researchers. So they were scientists, and so I'm thinking about Laura Conti, but also Giulio Mattacaro, Virginio Pettin. They were engaged intellectuals with a shared Marxist-based perspective about science, but they were also scientists. They were the kind of intellectuals that you showed in your French case. And the interesting thing is that they were innovators in their research field. They were bringing new methodologies, and they were a larger circle, but still they have reviews, they have situations in which they can interact with social movements and with institutional actors. And their inspiration was very commoner, which is the founder of the in the US of the science information movement, and they were much more they were following this idea of Barry Commoner of the need to disseminating accessible scientific facts to the public so that they could participate in decision making. So they were a lot into the importance of involving public into scientific decisions, and they were stressing the fact that science should not put aside from society, but should engage with visions of, let's say, imaginaries, techno-scientific imaginaries, and this would be the basis for them develop the appropriate science to follow this interest, general interest. And for those first political ecologists, science was really the instrument for finding the proper means of controlling the destructive forces that science has placed at the hands of humanity, let's say. And so they were concerned with science becoming, let's say, co-opted by powers, and so the problem of missing science as a fundamental instrument for social progress. But so and your study shows this shift from this critical perspective of science to a different perspective, which is the one of lay knowledge, the differences of knowledge. So the shift you point to in the 80s is quite interesting, because these critical forces that really put science at the center of the political visions are sort of replaced by something different, which is the idea of a non-critical co-construction of the knowledge. So the 80s, even in your reconstruction, are missing something in the way in which science is including public in its development. And I wanted to, reading your paper and listening to you, of course, I was thinking as well to the recent experiences we had with the pandemics, and we are having with the pandemics, and the way in which science was at the center of of many issues, and how it was impossible to create a counter publics. And then in the absence of a counter publics is something more like a populism that emerged. So one issue that I think it's interesting for me, from my point of view, is the difference between this vision of publics and counter publics, and the difference with populism. So and the link between science and populism. And I want to I was recently reading an edited book by Alberta Giorgi, Hande e Slenzia, which is exactly on populism and science. And I think that it's interesting to take into account how today it seems like a counter publics is quite difficult to. I mean, it's difficult to have a real counter publics, and how I mean, populism can occupy this place, which is left unaddressed by the absence of counter publics. And I was also thinking about that in other techno-scientific controversies. There is a huge use of idea of pseudoscience or folk science. There are a lot of ways to decredibilize issues that address the need for counter publics in science and technical development. So the conditions for a debatable science, for a dynamic of publics and counter publics, seems to be eroded today, less and less possible. So these are more comments, and now I come to some more, let's say, questions for you. I mean, the first thing I really find really interesting of the perspective you open is this idea of a movement which is unified but without homogenization. I mean, when you and in your conclusions, you stress that it is important that radical forms of protest, which basically states a non-negotiability, they put the confrontation as an out. There's no possibility of negotiating. These radical forms of protest should be linked to most scientific positions, so with spaces in which counter publics and publics can have I mean, this dynamic can actually happen. And so I was thinking about what can make this uneasy alchemy, to quote Barbara Allen, which is another STS scholar interested in social movement, what we need for this uneasy alchemy of radical positions and the efforts to build counter publics, what we need for this uneasy alchemy to happen. I mean, in your even in what you are seeing from the French example, if you have something to say about the condition of possibility of recreating this link between radical protest and the counter public approach in the case of the nuclear technology. And are the economic actors also part of this uneasy alchemy? So I was wondering if economic actors also are involved in this, so actors sustaining other technologies are part of this uneasy alchemy of trying to make the balance power shift on the side of a counter public position. So that was my first question for you. The second question was about the dimension of international circulations, because you spoke about the French case, but is there an international circulation, I mean, on the government side, but also on the movement side? And if you case, because I'm thinking about the asbestos case, in which we have proofs that the industry of asbestos were preparing for, knew about asbestos consequences and was devising international strategies to counter the emergence of, let's say, requests for ideologies from the workers' side. So is there something as well in the nuclear industry of concerted strategies at the level of the industry, or it just a national strategy? And then also on the side of the movements, if there are circulations among national, let's say, counter publics. So a third is not a question, but I would like you to share with us some of the difficulties you encountered in doing your investigation. There was how is it to investigate on the nuclear sector, and so your experience of doing research on and then yes, and I was also interested in what you say about exclusion and repression as a form of extrema ratio that you see applied in the French case. So it's not just disciplining technoscience, it's also exclusion and repression. So if you can say something about that. And the very last is about how social media are changing the governing of scientific dissent in the nuclear sector. And I'm thinking about the existence of nuclear influencers, let's say, because in Italy we have, for example, a guy who called himself l'avvocato dell'atomo, the advocate of the atom, and is a young engineer who has a YouTube channel, and he has an Instagram, and is basically playing the role of an influencer for young generations, supporting how nuclear energy is helping fighting climate change. So I don't know if this kind of new ways in which scientific information and the dynamic of publics and counter-publics take shape are part of your field of investigation. That's all.
Okay. We are managing a sort of collective. Thank you. So I'm very afraid by this system of automatically subtitulation because my English pronunciation, I don't know what could be pronounced by them. Okay. Short but not so simple question for you. The first is related to the historical problem. Comparing the history of anti-nuclear movements in Europe, the Italian case is, I said it's really interesting because there is a framework in the same years, different solution also in terms of internal political debate, produced two different results, but also two different narratives. In the Italian case, the case in which there is an official history that is a false one, totally false, because it is a classical representation in which the anti-nuclear movement is the first victory of the Green Party. The Green Party doesn't exist at the time. The anti-nuclear movement was a movement typically organized inside the extreme left party organization, not parties, and also maybe it's the last great struggle that started by the anti-systemic movements period in Italy. the second is that so the question is if in the French case is there a similar problem? The construction of a narrative about the history of the experience of the the second, so I think that this is also historically, and that in that case, in Italian case, was also the first time in which was explicitly present an internal conflict. I think that is the conflict also presented yesterday by Eric. Between classical workers' party that and the new environmental movement, because in that period the representation of the realized proposed by the workers' party was a representation of a not fast struggle of the environmental movements, and that means that this movement were not really interesting for the social change. Third, this is that I think I have to explain my presentation, my introduction. Effectively, I think that you, in a great part of the text you gave us and in your speech, talked about our work. Talking about the way in which we try to self-define our activity, and also the way we have to define our role inside the experience. So the answer is, do you prefer some definition? How do you think to yourself when you study and experience as a movement? And on the other side, to define, we had this problem, for example, with Dario in a research proposal. You define the kind of knowledge you understand. Because it's not the same to define, to use the term citizen science, collective knowledge, or for example, the definition of categories that are typical of the Latin American debate, like popular knowledge, popular science, popular epidemiology. And I think that there is a great lack inside the European debate about this problem, about a technical methodological problem that is related to the role of the self-definition and the definition of the category of the kind of knowledge. The last is more a suggestion that started about your research. In the case of the experience of Pripyat, the little town near, effectively, yes, sorry, the little town near Chernobyl, I don't know if you, near Chernobyl south, there is a little town that was substantially closed after the explosion, the first explosion, and that zone was closed for 40 years now. So it's effectively one of the first, probably, experience of subtraction to the human history of the zone, of the territory. Is there a relation in this struggle, in this debate, in the organization of movements, in the internal debate about the relation between the idea of subtraction to the human history and the idea of the ZAD? The ZAD, the zone de land, the experience of the land, the idea that this kind of struggle could be transformed in a sort of conflict on the definition of a space, not only in action, but only in the building on the political implication. Okay, so do you prefer to other question or to reply now?
Yes, you're right. But
No.
maybe you can. Okay.
Okay. Laura.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Sam, and thank you very much, Laura, for these inspiring comments and questions. I will try to address issues as far as I can. Maybe I can start with the last questions of Saul. First of all, regarding the issue of false national narratives about the anti-nuclear protests movements, and we wanted to know if there were eventually, cases like that I can relate about the French context. Well, one of the main things in France is, especially in the recent period, is about an official discourse, but also an official history, because knowing that the nuclear agencies have their own historians, Electricité de France has an association of electricity history, for instance. These organizations have their social science divisions, which work, which also collaborate with university scientists or public researchers, etc. So there is already a narrative which can be different and distinguishable done by these actors. But more broadly, the dominant narrative these past years is that, in fact, because the anti-nuclear movement also became less and less influent, the dominant narrative in France is to say that, the French people, as they are Cartesian publics, have always been pro-nuclear more than anti-nuclear. This is a kind of a controversial issue for the anti-nuclear movement, but for also the social science analysts, because this discourse has been officially dominant. To say, of course, France is the country of Marie Curie, Pierre Curie, Henri Becquerel. Of course, the radioactivity was discovered here. Of course, nuclear energy is our unnegotiable resource. And of course, French people have mostly been agreeing with the government policies, and so this narrative has kind of minimized over time the importance of the anti-nuclear movement of the 1970s, to such an extent that in some publications by some of those researchers within the nuclear agencies, the anti-nuclear movement was so marginal that it was kind of completely detached as something, as kind of so external to be considered as being part of the public phenomenon, which is something which was written afterwards. In fact, in the 1970s, I worked on the publications of, for instance, the public opinion experts or sociologists within the nuclear agencies, and they were not saying this. They were saying the issue was really seen as a social phenomenon, as a real threat. But then over the decades, this was kind of changed. So this is maybe one of the false narratives. That's why I think the anti-nuclear protesters are very sensitive to a kind of also memory building on the movement. So especially recently, there have been a lot of documentaries on the flow of struggle, documentaries on the anti-nuclear movement. So it is something which is, I think, interesting and important. Another maybe false narrative is a controversial one over the abandonment of the fast breeder superphoenix that I mentioned. it still continues the controversy among the pro-nuclears and anti-nuclears. The pro-nuclears saying, oh, it was an ideological decision of the Greens. Of course, the Greens had to do something, so they did this. They abandoned the most important plant in the country, and the anti-nuclears are saying, in fact, what I said, it was closed for the technical reason, etc. There is of course toujours a struggle over narratives, over memory building and counter memory building about the relation of the French public to nuclear energy, about also the career of the nuclear sector and the nuclear techno objects. In fact, well, how do they fade? Why do they fade? Is it a result of the victory of the resistances? Is it a result of something else? These are all controversial. Concerning class struggles, it has been quite central. It was quite central, in fact, in the 1970s movement, because well, I didn't detail everything, but one of the singularities of the French anti-nuclear movement is that the trade unionists from the French Nuclear Atomic Energy Commission were against nuclear energy in the 1970s. It is the only, to my knowledge, trade union of nuclear energy which was against nuclear energy for several years during 1970s. Because of the way how, of course, auto management would be impossible. In fact, it was mostly the Confédération Française CFTT Démocratique du Travail, which was a trade union which was very much on the left and which had auto management aspirations at that time. So nuclear energy, although they were working within the sector, they were considering that the massive implantation of the nuclear reactors would absolutely not allow an auto management, autogestion. Self-management, sorry. Autogestion. When they abandoned this strategy, this became less visible. But yeah, the class struggle in this sense was absolutely major, and what they really managed to publicize was the sufferings at work for the workers. There was for instance, a documentary which is called "Condemned to Gain, to Win," Condamné à réussir, which was showing the nuclear plant workers in the AG plant, especially as completely, respiring and suffering within those costumes, those clothes, in fact, protective clothes, which are called shadows. So how suffering was really at the heart of the new condition of man in the industrial society. So these were all questions that were really very much publicized. Also, the occupational risk issues were very much publicized. But the trade unions then followed a line which was really less radical or less really increased, less important in the following decades. So these regarding the labor issues, the movement really lost. But then it came back from the ex-colonies, for instance, from Niger, with the Nigerian uranium miners in the 2000s, who started to say, we have lost our health, we have lost our land, and we haven't won anything because the revenues from uranium do not profit to us. So that was a really huge mobilization from Niger, from Arlit and north of Niger, where then there have been military conflicts and other troubles. And also from the victims of the nuclear tests in especially Polynesia. So yeah, maybe we can also add the mobilization of women in the picture. Especially around the high region with the leukemia cases, but also with the people, the women especially, who contracted thyroid cancers after Chernobyl and who mobilized to say, yeah, women are not taken into consideration. Also, gender issues. Now they are coming back more. More importantly, especially at PUR, with an ecofeminism which is developing around the anti-nuclear protest. Our role inside the experience, how do you define your position, you ask me? In fact, I started this research as a PhD coming from a foreign country, a young person at that time who tried to understand how the most nuclearized country in the world, in fact, had become the most nuclearized country in the world, because coming from Turkey, for me, France was the country of the revolution, to be a little bit simple, and I wanted to know, well, because I was already reading, the French people are so much more on the streets than we in Istanbul, so what's happening, but don't they react to nuclear energy? What happens? So with this entry, already I, of course, had a position, but I didn't immediately need to explicit. But with the access of research, over the government, the way how the reactions to nuclear energy were governed by the state, by the French state, of course, I had to clarify a position also. And this position, I always assumed as somebody very critical vis-a-vis nuclear harms and nuclear development, which is not very easy in the French social science arena, because the issues of what Laura addressed as symmetry, etc., are already very dominant in the SS research, but especially in France, in the social science area, being anti-nuclear and being an analyst is not considered something possible, whereas in America it has not posed a problem. James Jasper starts his book by indicating how much he was active in the anti-nuclear movement. Gasperson, an anthropologist, again does the same thing. But in France, it is seen as something which is so. I kind of ignored this constraint, which finally made the result that I have observed that my work was very much followed by the nuclear agencies and the social science divisions within. I was never invited to present anything, but I also know that some of those researchers within the institutions who tried to, for instance, quote works like mine were censored. That's the fact. And I don't develop on this, but this is again, I haven't been struggling all the time to define a position. I just assume the position, in fact, a position which is the position of the analyst, but the analyst who chooses the way how to tackle the problem, as Laura said, in fact, until the finalization of the research, most of the work that existed on the nuclear countermeasures, etc., were really, as you said, focused on the internal dynamics of the movement. And this is also the result of the availability of what is accessible as empirical data. So I'm connecting with your question on the method and the difficulties. In fact, when you want to work on nuclear energy, most of the time you are redirected to work on the social movements because they are more accessible, because the working on the history or sociology of EDF, Kojima, nuclear experts of the state, in fact, really requires a time which is not compatible with the time of a PhD research. For instance, I tried to consult, of course, a lot of archives from CEA, EDF, ERSN, and others, and most of them didn't arrive to me before the finalization of my very long research, which lasted 5.5 years. France is the country where the access to official nuclear archives also for military, it's still another story, but even for the nuclear reactors, in fact, for the nuclear part, France has the most archaic, in my opinion, but also other colleagues agree, archive consultation system. In 2008 still, for instance, Électricité de France and Commissariat à l'Énergie Atomique hadn't numerized anything, not in terms of the archive papers from 60s to be numerized. I'm not speaking about this. They didn't have an accessible database just to see what exists, in fact, as documents to consult. So everything was only orally managed. And I know that until recently this had been the case, and things don't change really very. And this is also politics of course, secrecy, which is at the heart of these issues. But at that time, and Gabriel Hecht had the same experience, the practice was this. You were going to SEA, you were telling your project, and then the SEA archivist, who didn't change for 30 years, who is the same person, was saying, and she's still that, by the way, that she will look for the boxes for you. And indeed, to my surprise, I had the same boxes as the one that Gabriel Hecht was offered. We weren't working on the same thing exactly. So this is to say how it was difficult to, but what I did, in fact, was to counter this difficulty by recuperating or collecting a lot of archives, official archives from the retired persons. So I kind of created a confidence relation with retired engineers, retired even public opinion specialists that I found. And thanks to that, in fact, I could read a lot of official things because I went to their houses, really photographed a lot of things. But in terms of official access, it still is very difficult. It's really the most difficult context in the French context to work on. The American system has nothing to do with this, but much more available, much more accessible. Also, maybe to connect with, to finish with your question, Laura, on the same topic. I had a difficulty also, anyways, from the anti-nuclear side, not for the documents, but when I wanted to do an ethnography of one of those counter expertise laboratories, which was really discouraging for me at that time because, in fact, they didn't want me to do this research, and they were saying the same thing. They were saying, "Why are you working on us? We have a right to no error, and we cannot let somebody who is exterior, to come and consult our documents because these are very sensible documents and we need to maintain credibility. And so also, why are you working on us? You should go and work on the nuclear agencies, etc." So this was really a big struggle with at least one of those organizations to create a kind of trust relationship, and I didn't really access to archives, all of archives at this point. For this, but which was also a very important point for my research because it was showing how this idea of we don't have right to any error was important, in fact, for this movement in their reappropriation of the technicity of the things. And when they were saying this to me, they were certainly thinking about how I would interpret perhaps their countermeasures, their all these things, in fact. So I also replied your question on this, Laura, I think. I will shift to the question on Pripyat. The relation between the idea of subtraction or the abandonment of whole lands and maybe how it can be repoliticized for occupational. In fact, I haven't really reflected on this. I don't think I'm just improvising, but this has been, I mean, the abandonment of whole lands after a nuclear accident has been a long-term negotiation and issue, in fact, for nuclear energy promoters, starting already from late 1950s. And gradually, especially after the Chernobyl accident in the international arena, the leitmotif was consisted of considering that the less you lose lands, the better the world will go. But before it was not this leitmotif, so there has been a shift in the, and this we can see really clearly when we compare the Chernobyl and the Fukushima accident cases, because after Chernobyl, it was still possible for the Soviet Union to abandon Pripyat, for instance, and villages. And when you look at, of course, you will tell me Japan has not the same geography, has not the same, how you say, it's not also, it's not so vast. But anyway, it was also part of what was going on the international arena, that Japan, under the Abe government, namely, considered there was no possibility to abandon anything. No possibility to abandon anything at all. So around the Fukushima plant, even the very little zone where they are storing the waste, in fact, should be revalorized, and this is really in the expert reports. It is, nothing is considered that land, whereas in the Soviet Union it was not, it was not the issue really. They could abandon, and so in Japan, nothing should be abandoned, but people who stay in these places very contaminated in the Fukushima zone are valorized. They are valorized, and most of them are retired persons who don't want to leave really their homeland. And in France especially, there has been, starting from the 5th anniversary of Fukushima accident, a lot of romanticization of those people who occupy these areas, because they are considered as brave, and also to insist on the fact that it is important not to really, it's important really to minimize land loss, because people's attachment to their lands is more important than a presumably safe environment. So we should look at what their expectations are. I'm not really responding to you on this, but well, we can come back to that later. I'm too long.
No, technically, we are going to ask.
Okay, then I can come to your questions, right?
Thanks. Okay. Today, I think it's
Yeah. Hello, Sabine. Thank you so much. I'm actually feeling a bit silly that I haven't come to say hello and greet you and talk about a few things already, but I will for sure in the future. Yeah, but thank you. So I have three more questions. First, about the historicizing part. I recall, like, because it touched on how the whole nuclear plan has emerged from the 1974 crisis, from the energy, the big oil crisis, and so on. I wonder whether you or anybody else are familiar with the work of American philosopher Janet Reutemann, who has written a book, Anti-Crisis. It's basically criticizing how the notion of crisis is mobilized as a device to produce a certain kind of politics over and over again. Yeah, I wonder whether you have reflected a bit critically about this, also considering the moment we're in now, also talking about energy and crisis. And yeah, I kind of interrogate myself very often whether, as researchers, analysts, we should strategically, tactically, as knowledge co-producers, do without the notion of crisis. I was going to ask the same thing, a similar thing yesterday to Erika. I'm happy that I got some space to ask this to you today even more. The second small one, yeah, it comes back in several fields. The continuum between the military technology innovation during warfare and how in post-war or secondary moment these technologies are reconfigured to other industries and reapplied. This is something that is quite important for me also as a militant. So for instance, I'm active and I work on agriculture, and there we have like quite a few excellent examples of this, like first in the interwar period, chemical fertilizers, synthesization of nitrogen that it's been used, it's been developed more for explosive technologies than for enriching the soil later, but also drones, satellite, in the later phase of the revolution and digitalization today. So I wonder whether you have a take on this and whether you have also recommendations or scholarship literature or interesting, relevant arguments on this. Yeah, and finally, I have a question about your take on technoscience. I appreciated that you use the plural, technosciences, but I think I may have missed it throughout your presentation, but I didn't encounter a definition or, like it seems to me that you use technoscience as an analytical category of something like a quite, circumcised process or entity to be contested. With like I wonder, because there's of course a very vast literature on this. I personally am interested in it. I don't know it very much, but of course stemming all the way down to basically technoscience is everything, and we are all technoscientifically involved as cyborgs and so on. Yeah, because for instance, in your presentation, there is this whole moment with the ACRU and the CRIAD, all these associations and civil societies, where there seems to be also some community-led engagements with tinkering people and groups tinkering, experimenting, crafting different knowledge, engaging with technoscientific knowledge and practices. Yeah. So, and by the way, I also couldn't hear well during your presentation what you called them. You said, and these I call them tech-to-tech experts or something like this. Tech-attack?
Yeah.
This is French.
Yeah.
Okay.
I don't know how to translate.
Thank you.
Other question?
Thank you for the presentation and thank you for the questions before. The first question is not a question. Can you stress the role of technician? We were talking about before, but the role, what was the role of technician in the struggle? Maybe in this technoscience paradigm, scientization of the debate on the climate question, the role of technician inside the process of production could be useful for the descientization of the debate. The second thing is about a question about much material question. Your research stopped in the 90s, but with you see a certain line of continuation with global movements like Fridays for Future and Extinction Rebellion on the scientization of the debate, also in France on the anti-nuclear issue. And yeah, that's all. More empirical question from me. Thank you so much.
Other question?
Yeah, thank you for the presentation. It was really, really insightful. And one aspect that I was interested in was the aspect of class struggle in the 70s and its subsequent decline. So I was wondering whether you could elaborate a bit on the way the unions changed after the 70s, in which way that that fostered the decline of trade unions' engagement in this question. Because you said that in the 70s there was this trade union that was basically against nuclear from within because of their political leanings. And then this movement was lost, and I was interested in this process of the loss of movement from the union side.
Okay, thank you for your talk. I have just two brief questions. on two topics you didn't address, so maybe they are outside your framework. So I don't know if you. The first one is around the problem of authoritarianism, which was effectively one of the main issues of forced nuclear movements, for example, in Italy. And I remember that one of the main points also against the nuclear form of energy is that it demands a central power, so it's a kind of justification of the state. And I'm curious how these issues still a problem, because the need of the central power is not just to build up the nuclear plant, but also to dismantle it and to manage the waste. So if there is a debate today on movements are addressing this question, also when asked to stop the nuclear energy firms. And the second question is about the ontology point, the ontology entry. So I'm wondering if how you can, if you can, how to say, if there are a kind of ontological question which is posed in these struggles, specifically related to the risk issues, if the way to manage, to understand the risk, and to respond to the risk issues, and how movement contrast technician responses, as also an ontological implication on how reality is conceived, constructed, or deconstructed. I don't know if it's clear, but
Just say 2 words again.
What?
Just clarify a little bit more.
The second one?
Yeah.
I mean, if the nuclear systems and the risk it poses, and how these issues of risk is contested, also calls for a kind of ontological struggles on how we conceive our relationship with the material world, how the material world is performed into this into the nuclear system and the management of risk. The question is not clear because it's really not clear these issues to me, so it's not simple.
Okay. We have other 2 questions, and I think 2 questions. What? Follow.
Thank you very much. It was really, really interesting. Also because I grew up with my mother's from France, and she's really enthusiastic about the whole anti-nuclear movement. So I really got like the whole mindset. And I'm like, it reminded me a lot. And at the same time, for example, my mother now, she's also part of an anti-vaccine movement. And she also refers a lot to societies and associations in France that do research on the anti-mRNA vaccine. I think it's centered in Toulouse. And when I saw the name of the Société Anti-Nuclear Research, or I don't know what it's called, it reminded me of this. Well, I don't know. Some people say it's pseudo-scientific activism, but you could also say that's a scientization of activism, of social movements. But then where do we draw a line between what is scientific and not? Because you said, well, pseudo-scientific is used to delegitimize and stigmatize certain activism, but at the same time, you believe in or you use the category of science. So what is the category that is not science? And how do you draw the border? Because you also talk about, you define scientization as a reorganization of protest in scientific terms. And you say also that that a scientization of protest can eliminate non-scientific positions or positions that do not draw on the values of science. So I would say it's non-scientific positions. But this is really risky, right, to say something like this. How do you deal with that? And I think that anti-vaccine scientization.
Sorry.
Okay. Thank you for this really interesting presentation. I had a question about how the object of science shapes scientization and different movements of contestation around scientific knowledge. Because obviously in the 1970s, well, obviously, physics was perhaps the most prestigious, even hegemonic science, whereas today it's arguably Earth system science. Those have very, very different objects and they proceed by different means. In one case, you have the Earth system itself as a lab in a sense. On the other, you have labs that have to be constructed in a completely different way and the isolation of the atom. So those are different ontologies in a sense that you have to relate to when you're building both the technical infrastructure and when you're struggling against it or for its transformation. So I'm wondering how that's shifting and how, let's say, how our image of what science is shifting by Earth system science becoming the most prestigious or most important or most consequential science in many ways. It's also the question of the reversibility of the processes that are studied or not. So I'm wondering, like, science is many things, right? So if we break down science and at other points in history, it might have been medicine or chemistry, let's say in the 20s, 30s and 40s that were the most prestigious, also because they were seen as most consequential in social terms. So I'm wondering how this is changing and how it's changing our conception of what nuclear energy is, that we have now a more ecological paradigm, arguably, also with epidemiology, which is arguably on the one hand political, on the other hand ecological, where scientific is ecological, whereas consequential is political in a way that's very direct and immediate. So I'm wondering whether that shifts our understanding of scientization.
After we have Priscilla and then Carmen.
Very quickly, just whether some complication in the ontologization of scientization, I suppose I would say so. Because it used to me that there are kind of dispositives that produce ontologies, one of which is the way in which, for example, safety or health are framed in institutional terms. For example, there are differences. Now I'm not prepared to say exactly because it was not a clear point to make. But I know that there are huge differences in different countries. So I was supposed to be in France, what is the situation, according to as regards the health of workers. Because in some cases, the health of workers is a part of the competencies of the Ministry of Labour, say, or industry sometimes. Another situation, it is competence of the Ministry of Health. And this difference make a lot of relevance because the same problem can be framed as a problem of labor contracts, in which you provide for something, or a general problem else, which belongs to the citizens as such. And so also the criteria for determining if there is a health problem may differ, and the way in which also you make a legal issue against some damage or whatever. So I was curious in the case of France how the health of workers, because I suppose also in the mobilization of the works in this aspect, maybe I said already something I was out for organizing call, so I apologize.
Sheila, to you.
Hi, many thanks for your great presentation. It was very interesting to better understand the counter-science movement in France. I would like to know if you could talk a little bit more about the workforce performance and concern in the anti-nuclear movement, although you have already gave a context of the trade union participation. I am curious about the relation between these scientists and the nuclear workers. It was not very clear to me. I'm sorry if you talked about it and I didn't get it. So the counter scientists and activists were contesting the nuclear project. I would like to better understand, for example, the configuration of this counter movement. Were the counter scientists and the nuclear workers more separated from each other, or it was more a mixed group like allies? There were nuclear workers that were scientists too, contesting the nuclear energy, for example. There was any concern on the nuclear workers in the scientific contestation? I mean, they were correctly contesting the nuclear project and its risks and problems. And I understood that the counter movements could not reach an agreement of when to end the nuclear energy and how, but when they were thinking about it, did they think about the nuclear workforce? Did the trade union, for example, included some discussion about this when they were more powerful in the 70s, I think? And did the nuclear workers took part in this process of thinking what to do and how to redesign their work, for example?
You, Carmen?
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you for the great presentation. I have a question regarding the third model, the co-expertise model that you mentioned about stakeholder participation in the expertise production, which is organized top-down. Because I'm thinking here also of transdisciplinary research and the role of participatory knowledge production in sustainability issues. And yes, I would like to know if you have come across some insights in your research how the participation could work in a way that the participants are not being used, for example, as you mentioned in the paper, to restore public legitimacy. Thank you.
No, we could take little time. In the next 24 hours, I think that not so problematic.
It was the before about the boundaries of the risk that change in time and space.
I know.
Instead of a solution. Anyway, yes, we were talking just before about the boundaries in time and space of the framing, the light framing, but it's sake of understanding of framing the risk. And this is very close to the previous comments about institution participating to address the risk, to define risk, to be enacted and enact the risk and those elements, human and non-human, that participate to that, but also to epistemological communities or professional communities that were involved in during the timeline of the story that you were. So is there a sort of changing map of this kind of risk and the boundaries, that identify this risk?
Thank you very much. The room is as proliferating as atoms in terms of questions. I didn't count, but I maybe more than 30. I'm not sure I will be able to address everything. I'm really sorry, but maybe I will start with the last and then try to come to the first. Concerning the boundaries of this, if we can come to the You said we can come to the PPE or there's something on which I worked really through the press archives and systematic review of how the public debate on risks evolved over the decades. In fact, maybe I was naive. I was at the beginning considering in terms of shift from societal risk definition to technical risk definition. So nuclear energy seen as a risk for its society, for its organization, for centralism, centralist society, authoritarian society that the opponents did not want to prevent, to then a shift to technical risk issues, etc. But then, yeah, my approach was also to understand how even the technical risk issues, so segmented risks, could be, in fact, even at a singular, when they are, you know, separate, can contribute to politicized, and we see it very well with the radioactive waste, the focus on the waste problem currently, how it gradually became a way to revive the movement, in fact, which was completely unexpected. Since 2016-17, really the waste problem and the focus on this has been the motor of the revival. So, but yeah, but I did, but I don't know where that. So this one, yeah. Sorry, I forgot to put it actually. Well, so on the 4 decades, yeah, we can follow, and this is really interesting approach because it's really is at the heart of the analysis of the framing, reframing, and reframing, and I think yeah, it is essential to understand not only to we should pay attention not to have an analyst bias considering that something can be reductionist, etc., but more frequently look at how it manages or not, even at the reductionist perspective, to revive of it. In fact, the more general framing of the debates. I don't know. No. Concerning Carmen's question, I don't know the names of everybody, but on co-expertise model, is there a hope for participatory experiences in the nuclear sector? In fact, I don't believe that we should, as analysts, be normative on these questions because the actors that we are working on are already reflexive enough to evaluate, to make a return experience from their own participation to these exercises. And believe me, they have been lobbying, in fact, also. While they less and less believe in the efficiency of these dispositives, it doesn't mean that they abandon them immediately, but they evaluate and do lobbying on the ways how to still maintain the possibility to have these official expertise circles open when needed, so that they can come and get out, so I don't have a reset, but I rely on the fact that the policy of trial and error is something interesting to take into account because it's already done by the actors themselves. Sheila's question on scientists and nuclear workers, which relation. In the 1970s, the relation was very tight because the trade unionists of safety were members of GSUN. They worked very tightly with the concerned scientists movement. They were within. Some of them were already in the before 1968 or just after, in the aftermath of 1968, in the critical of science movements together. I don't speak about them. I'm speaking about the engineer level. I'm not speaking about the workers level or technician level completely, but the engineers at the trade unions who were the managers of the trade unions or the important personalities, like Bernard Laponche, who is a historical figure, still very important in the anti-nuclear movement, was in fact also in the scientists group, but not only him. So they were the trade unions and the public researchers, public scientists were together work together. But then in the recent periods, as I said, the trade unions, CFDT, CGT, became more, how we say, conciliating on these issues and also changed policies. And also there is a whole work which was done by the experts and official bodies to quote these actors, trade union actors, which has been a reason for neutralizing their criticism, in fact. But other colleagues worked on this. I didn't really work on this is one of the lacuna of the work. I mean, I didn't work on the internal criticism and how it was managed but my colleague Marie Gies, for instance, worked on this abundantly, and I think she published also in English. I can provide them the references if you like. On Luigi's question, the way how the workers' radio protection should be managed has been object of fights, struggles, controversies in the 1970s, starting from 1950s and until the end of 1990s. In fact, it was a central service called the Service Central pour la Protection contre les rayonnements ionisants at the heart of Ministry of Health, which was responsible for the radio protection of all the workers, also in the abroad. And in 2000, there is a movement of autonomization of these regulatory bodies, which was a contradictory movement because at the same time, the radio protection of workers became managed by triple ministries of health, industry, and work. That was also kind of, at the same time, they claimed to be independent because they got out from the hegemony of the Atomic Energy Commission, which was not the case for SCPRE, this service that I mentioned, because there was a very huge circulation of experts between the nuclear agencies and the service. But at the same time, the economy really took the kind of the control in the sense of if this can respond to the question. The question about authoritarianism of Mara, central power, and not only Bilbao, also this model. Well, this is completely crucial in the French debate. In fact, the centralism, the authoritarian management and governance, again, which finally resulted in the creation of some independent agencies, but which are very weak in France in terms of their means for the control of security, for instance. The Autorité de Sûreté Nucléaire, ASN, is at the same time respected, but has little means knows and recognizes it has little means, in fact, to control the Électricité de France and the way how it manages the safety of its nuclear plants. In fact, for instance, in terms of information, it is really the utility company who decides what information to provide, etc., which creates a lot of tensions. But more importantly, we should emphasize the fact that the nuclear energy sector is state sector, is state property in France still, although there has been a very marginal privatization. So the state is in fact nuclear at the first sight, and which explains why the companies do not do bankrupt. In fact, they go on bankrupt. They go on a bankrupt, but they are immediately saved. So there is still really this possibility to, thanks to this state property, to gain the whole control of the central organization, which also explains why the country expertise organs cannot really be very abundant or widespread. I don't know if this replies this, but I think simultaneously. The question on the question is on just a minute. I will have a look at the book Anti-Crisis. Thanks. Should we do without the notion of crisis? It depends on the way how what Eric called, I think, populism or climate populism or other type of populism. Here we can speak about green nuclear fetish. Really meet the way how things are managed, I would say. I mean, I don't know if as analysts we have the privilege to how do you say, invisibilize which is visibilized as a crisis situation, but it depends on who defines what a crisis is, in what circumstances, with what kind of causes of definition or identification. Because yeah, at least I don't at this position find it heuristically very productive to say we're all the time in the crisis, so we won't speak about the crisis, but rather to look at what the construction or deconstruction of crisis, in fact, how it affects the democratization processes and the processes of more sobriety or better futures, I would say. Maybe it's a very poor interpretation, but yeah. The continuum between military technologies, civil technologies, what should be, how should we position ourselves on this? This is a real problem, at least on where I work. Of course, nuclear complexes are most of the time military industrial complexes in US, in UK, in France, not everywhere, but in France specifically. But at the same time, historically, the division between the two was a political work, very efficient political work. As you know, already from the start of the United States, it was politics, a very deep politics, in fact, with the Atoms for Peace campaign, which finally aimed to counter the mobilizations, the pacifist mobilizations against the bomb and against the nuclear tests, by putting forward the civil benefits of nuclear energy, etc. And such a division, which was introduced by the decision makers, by the politicians, by the promoters of nuclear technologies, really had an impact also, including the social science agendas. For instance, at least in France, I can speak, those who work on civil are very, do not really dialogue a lot with those who work on military, and even the journalists, when they contact you, they will ask if you're civil or military. It's really and it's a problem which should be resolved before the reality catches us. How did it catch us? It already has caught us. In fact, in February, I think, with what happened in the Zaporizhzhia power plant, also with the Chernobyl power plant, which was attacked by Russia. And then all of a sudden, all of the world, but for a small while, I would say, discovered that the nuclear power plants were not maybe so ecological, but rather kind of slow bombs, or even free bombs, I would say, because they are even more free than any nuclear arms, in fact, in case of war, etc. So the reality catches us, but it should not. I think there should be really a connection made. So I really say there should be activism in social science and in also political ecology to really reconnect these struggles, because the technologies inherently are imbricated. In the case of nuclear, at least, but also you mentioned fertilizers, satellites, we can speak about drones and everything. Technologically, they are imbricated, politically, they are imbricated, but historically, there has been this necessity to visibilize one in order to invisibilize the other. That connects to your question with the question that I couldn't answer, but really in the French context, for instance, when in the 1980s, when the what I call the conformation and then the co-expertise model were getting, were rising in the management of the public opinion and the public criticism. At the same time, that was the Mitterrand's government, at least, immediately said, okay, I allow more openings to the civil society as to what concerns nuclear energy issues, but don't touch the military issues. So otherwise, I will stick the rainbow barrier in 1985. Because at the same time, Greenpeace was investing the train of nuclear tests in Polynesia, etc. So there is we should really, I think, look at together how the strategies mobilized and addressed to one type of criticism aim to, in fact, invisibilize other strategies, mostly more hard strategies, repressive strategies, etc. Okay, the question about the link of the French anti-nuclear movement or protests with the recent movements. My research doesn't really stop in the 1990s, but I couldn't present everything. The book really goes to the immediate after Fukushima period, in fact. So I have also tackled the transnationalization issues of the movement, especially with Germany, with the rise of the ultra-modernist movement, with the rise of of course, the climate movements, and how ambiguities, etc., but also alliances were constructed within among the French protesters. I haven't had the opportunity to look at the extension rebellion, but what is interesting is probably, at least in the French media, how this movement is, especially the fact that one of the former spokespersons, in fact, quit the movement to become pro-nuclear, to say finally, okay, climate is important, but nuclear is a solution to kind of the fetishization of green nuclear again for the climate, was really abundantly, abundantly addressed in the media, in the public space, which is certainly also a way of trying to, at least for some actors, because within the media there are a lot of journalists who are very pro-nuclear. Some of them, for instance, from Le Point, recently really compared the anti-vaccine movement to anti-nuclear, saying that these are the same things, these are pseudosciences, and exactly the same thing, etc. This should be looked at in the extension rebellion or other very recent movements, but I'm not doing this at the moment. I was impressed by the reflections, thanks a lot, on the notion of scientization, and listening to you, I thought to myself, maybe should I have started technicization instead of scientization, which seems to create some confusion, maybe, because maybe the reference to science is so polyvalent that it doesn't really reflect exactly what I say with the dynamics that I observe, in fact, within these activism forms of different activisms that I study. But it's really a just question to ask whether it wouldn't be risky to say that the scientized forms of action eliminate or the non-scientific positions, etc. Your question. I would say maybe I said it too rapidly during the presentation, but in the written versions, I think I'm not really speaking about the elimination of non-scientific positions, but rather the more politicized positions, which is not exactly the same thing. I mean, in the sense of posing the questions in their different dimensions, and not only, for instance, in terms of what was the contamination here exactly, etc. So I don't know if it's, and maybe to come back, because your questions were, I think we can finish. Do you want me to finish? It's already right, right? Okay. So that Laura said she'd like put an arrays on the battery will stick later. Thanks a lot, guys. Really.